Picture this, you're 6 years old, barely tall enough to reach the table, still learning how to read, and in 5 minutes, you're going to be crowned Queen of England. It's November 1st, 1396. Paul's Cathedral in London glows with the flicker of hundreds of candles, their flames reflecting in the towering Gothic windows like tiny spirits bearing witness. The sound of the great organ rolls through the cathedral's vast stone arches as a solemn royal procession moves down the central aisle. But this is no ordinary ceremony. At the heart of it walks a child, Isabelle of France, just 6 years old. Draped in heavy gold silks and barely able to keep her tiny crown from slipping, she steps slowly toward the altar. There stands Richard II, King of England, 29 years old, regal and waiting. In moments, the child will become his queen, not by choice, not by love, but by the weight of politics. This wedding is a deal, a treaty, a gamble between two kingdoms. And for Isabelle, it's the beginning of a life written not by fairy tales, but by diplomacy, duty, and quiet sorrow. So how does a 6-year-old girl end up as the glittering pawn in one of the darkest diplomatic games of the Middle Ages? To understand the tragic fate of little Isabelle, we have to go back to a France drowning in shadows and fear. It's the late 14th century, and the French crown is not a symbol of strength, but of madness. Isabelle was born on November 9th, 1389, in the opulent halls of the Louvre Palace. Not the museum we know today, but a fortress of royal intrigue and hidden sorrow. She was the fourth daughter of King Charles VI of France and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. On paper, she was a princess. In reality, she was born into a court unraveling at the seams. Her father, Charles VI, remembered by history as Charles the Mad, had been plagued by terrifying bouts of insanity since the age of 24. During his episodes, the king would forget his own wife and children. He believed his body was made of glass and would shatter with a single touch. There were days when he ran screaming through palace corridors, convinced invisible enemies were chasing him. With the king trapped inside his broken mind, France was left in the hands of feuding regents, power-hungry nobles who tore the kingdom apart from the inside. And as for Isabelle's mother, Isabeau of Bavaria was no helpless queen. She was clever, ambitious, and fiercely political, but her reputation was equally scandalous. Whispers followed her wherever she went. In this court of madness, manipulation, and unrelenting ambition, little Isabelle was never just a child. She was a symbol, a bargaining chip, and soon the key to a desperate alliance that would shape the fate of two great kingdoms. Isabeau of Bavaria, Isabelle's mother, was no grieving wife, ambitious, unscrupulous, cold as the marble floors of the palace she ruled. As her husband slipped deeper into madness, Isabeau filled the void, seizing power and amassing wealth with razor-sharp precision. The chroniclers of the time did not spare her. They called her dissolute, immoral, a queen who entertained lovers openly, while her children were little more than forgotten shadows in the corners of gilded halls. For Isabeau, her daughters weren't cherished companions. They were chess pieces, princesses with price tags, each one destined to be sold to the highest bidder on the map of European politics. Little Isabelle grew up in this poison-drenched court. Her world was one of whispered betrayals, velvet lies, and constant danger. France itself was bleeding, ripped apart by the endless 100 Years' War with England, by the civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, and by the unbearable weight of a crown worn by a man lost in delusions. And for a child as young and sensitive as Isabelle, the trauma ran deep. She watched her father spiral, sometimes blankly staring into space, sometimes screaming, sometimes running in terror from enemies no one else could see. She watched her mother rule with ice in her veins, handing out smiles like currency, and making decisions that shattered lives with a flick of her wrist. Then, in 1396, everything changed. Isabelle was just 6 years old when a door suddenly opened, a political moment so ripe it couldn't be ignored. Across the Channel, King Richard II of England was desperate. After years of war, he wanted peace. Peace to silence his enemies at home, peace to strengthen his claim to power. He had recently lost his beloved wife, Anne of Bohemia, and now needed a new marriage, a strategic one. Enter France. The French council, led by the cunning Duke of Berry, saw the English proposal for what it was, a rare, golden opportunity. And who better to offer as the seal of that peace than the prettiest, most delicate piece on the board? Little Isabelle, a kingdom in ruins, a king on the edge, and a child with no say in her own fate. The proposal came with glittering promises, an eye-watering dowry of £800,000, an unimaginable fortune, and a 28-year truce between France and England. For a nation crippled by war, drowning in debt and fractured by civil unrest, it was a lifeline. Peace could be bought if they were willing to pay the price, and the price was Isabelle. The negotiations dragged on for months. Months in which men in fine robes spoke about the little girl's future with the clinical detachment of merchants trading livestock. French and English ambassadors haggled over terms as if Isabelle were nothing more than a parcel to be wrapped and delivered. Her age, even in the medieval world where young girls were often married early, raised eyebrows. 6 was considered shockingly young. Even some English advisors suggested they wait until she turned 12, the customary age for a marriage to be fully consummated. But King Richard II didn't have time. His throne was fragile, his coffers nearly empty, and his enemies were circling like vultures. The need for peace and the vast French dowry outweighed every moral hesitation. He was desperate, and desperation silences conscience. By October 1396, the deal was sealed. Isabelle of France would be sent across the sea, not as a child, not as a daughter, but as an offering, a tiny political hostage wrapped in silk and innocence. Her farewell was staged with all the spectacle of a royal ceremony, designed less for family closure and more to impress the English envoys watching from the gilded shadows of the Louvre Palace. In a rare moment of clarity, Charles VI, her father, shed tears as he placed a trembling hand on his daughter's head and gave her his blessing. For a flicker of time, the mad king remembered her. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, was far less sentimental. She treated the parting like a well-executed business transaction. No tear, no hesitation, only the satisfaction of a queen who had just secured a powerful alliance. And as for Isabelle, she was only 6. She didn't understand. Not fully. To her, this was not diplomacy. This was confusion, fright, the unknown. All she knew was that she was leaving, and that no one asked her if she wanted to go. To little Isabelle, the journey across the sea felt more like an adventure than exile. In her mind, it wasn't forever. Perhaps she believed she'd be coming home soon, back to her familiar rooms in the Louvre, back to her dolls and her nursemaids. She was only 6. How could she have known? She brought with her the things a child treasures most, a handful of toys, her favorite dolls, and a small lapdog who had never left her side in the vast halls of the palace. That dog, warm and loyal, was her last tie to the life she was leaving behind. But to the world around her, Isabelle was no little girl. She was a treasure in transit. Her royal escort was massive, hundreds of nobles, ladies in waiting, servants, guards, all charged with protecting France's most valuable political offering. The journey from Calais to London took weeks, winding through cities and towns that transformed into stages for royal pageantry. Each English city they passed through competed for grandeur, parades, feasts, fanfare, each trying to outdo the last in honor of the child queen-to-be. But all the splendor only frightened her. The crowds, the noise, the strange language. Isabelle was overwhelmed. She cried often. She asked to go home. No one listened. And then came London. Richard II had spared no expense. The wedding would be the grandest in decades, part declaration, part spectacle, part theater of power. St. Paul's Cathedral was transformed. its soaring arches draped in silks of red and blue, English lions stitched beside French fleur-de-lis, banners of peace fluttering in candlelight. Thousands of candles, imported from France, bathed the stone in a golden glow. Choirs sang in Latin and French, their voices rising into the vaults like incense. It was dazzling and heartbreaking. This wasn't just a wedding, it was propaganda, a message to England and the world. The war is over, and the king has forged peace not with the sword, but with diplomacy. Richard II, tall and elegant, stood at the altar in resplendent robes. At 29, he was seen as one of Europe's most cultivated monarchs, a man of poetry, art, and refinement. He had adored his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, and her death had nearly broken him. Now, standing across from a child in gold-stitched silk, the contrast was jarring. He was not cruel. In truth, the whole arrangement embarrassed him. But the realm was crumbling. Enemies within, empty treasuries, whispers of rebellion. The marriage, this spectacle, was not about love. It was about survival. So, before the eyes of bishops, nobles, and two kingdoms, Richard II took the hand of a child, barely old enough to write her name, and made her Queen of England. She stood still beneath the vaulted ceilings of St. Paul's Cathedral, the echo of Latin prayers washing over her like waves. Little Isabel, crowned in silk and gold, remained silent, her wide eyes darting through the crowd, searching for one familiar face. Just one. But none remained. The Archbishop of Canterbury, realizing she was too small to reach, knelt before her, gently sliding the ring onto her delicate finger. The air was thick with incense, politics, and expectation. When the final words were spoken, when she was officially declared Queen of England, there was no joy on her face, only confusion and fear. And so began Isabel's life in a foreign land. To Richard II's credit, he treated her not as a wife, but as a child, a daughter. He gave her French tutors, preserved her language and customs, and made sure she was surrounded by familiar comforts. She was given apartments in Westminster Palace, her own manor house, and a retinue of servants who existed solely for her care. For a time, she lived in a gilded cage, but it was, at the very least, a gentle one. But peace, like childhood, does not last long. In September 1399, the world crumbled. Richard II, already under immense pressure, was overthrown by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, soon to be crowned Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned in the bleak, cold walls of Pontefract Castle, and not long after, he was dead. Murdered, some whispered. Silenced, others claimed. Either way, he was gone. And Isabel, now only 10 years old, was a widow, a queen without a king, a child who had never been truly a wife, but who now carried the full weight of that title in mourning. Her presence posed a dilemma for the new English regime. Technically, she was still Queen of England, but her marriage had never been consummated, and she bore no heir. Yet France would demand her return, and with her, they would demand something far more painful than a child bride. They would want the dowry back, the £800,000, long spent, scattered across war efforts, royal indulgences and political schemes, was gone. Returning, Isabel meant facing a diplomatic reckoning England could not afford. So they hesitated. They stalled. They caged the Queen in grief and limbo. And Isabel, no longer a princess, not yet a woman, was left in silence once more. After Richard's death, Isabel became more than a widow. She became a pawn once again. Henry IV, the new King of England, knew exactly what she represented: a valuable hostage, a bargaining chip. He kept her not in chains, but in golden confinement. Havering Castle became her new cage. Comfortable, yes, but still a prison. She spent 3 long years there, waiting, writing, pleading. The little girl who had once clutched her dolls on the road to London had become a young woman forged by sorrow. Her letters home, some barely legible through tear stains, reveal a soul aged far beyond her years. "I write to you in tears," she told her father, "for I am kept here like a prisoner, far from all I love, without hope of return." Those words, desperate, direct, raw, somehow pierced the fog of her father's broken mind. In a rare moment of lucidity, Charles VI stood firm. He demanded Isabel's return, not as a symbol, not as a queen, as his daughter. The negotiations dragged on, tangled in political ego and the wreckage of a spent dowry. But finally, in the year 1401, Isabel came home. But what returned to France was not the same girl who had left it. She was 12 now, but looked older, hollow-eyed, cautious, quiet. The palace at the Louvre should have welcomed her with open arms, but instead, it met her with cool calculation. France was still in chaos. Her family, preoccupied with war, court intrigue, and their own survival, treated her not as a lost daughter restored, but as a diplomatic relic. And the tragedy wasn't over. Isabel had dreamed of going home, but she had outgrown her childhood dreams. What she found in Paris wasn't comfort. It was a battlefield of its own, one where even her return was met with suspicion, tension, and plans for yet another marriage. Because in medieval Europe, there was always another alliance to forge, always another girl to sacrifice. In 1405, at just 16 years old, Isabel was bartered once again. Her mother, ever the strategist, arranged a second marriage, this time to Charles of Orleans, a young French nobleman and poet. Another political match, another alliance to be sealed. But against all odds, something extraordinary happened. Charles wasn't like the others, sensitive, gentle, a lover of words rather than war, and, most unbelievably, he loved her, not as a queen, not as a symbol, but as Isabel. For the first time in her life, she was not a pawn, but a partner. In their brief time together, they built a quiet happiness. They shared poetry, music, laughter behind closed doors, a soft rebellion against the roles the world had forced them into. For a fleeting moment, Isabel knew what it felt like to be cherished. Not for what she represented, but simply for who she was. But fate, once again, was merciless. In 1407, just 2 years into their marriage, Charles was captured by the English at the Battle of Agincourt. He would spend the next 25 years in captivity. Isabel once again was left alone, this time a widow in all but name. Once again, love had been torn from her hands. She returned to the French court, not as a girl, not as a queen, but as a shadow. She lived quietly, away from power, away from pageantry. She devoted herself to charity and the arts, and behind the scenes, she lent her hard-won knowledge of diplomacy to her family, guiding others in the very game that had cost her everything. In 1409, she gave birth to her only child, a daughter, Joan of Orleans. Becoming a mother gave Isabel a brief spark of joy, but it came wrapped in bitterness. She knew too well what kind of life awaited a girl born to royalty, a life of being chosen, traded, and sacrificed. Later that same year, at just 20 years old, Isabelle of France died from complications following childbirth. No parades marked her passing, no choir sang, no cathedral was draped in silk. The same world that had once crowned her in a blaze of candles now let her slip away in silence. But her story did not die with her. Isabel had done everything the crown demanded. She had married for peace, born an heir, bowed to politics, and worn the crown of England as a child. But she never truly lived for herself. Her life was a haunting reflection of the brutal realities facing royal daughters, used as currency, denied childhood, stripped of agency. A stark reminder that behind the opulence of medieval courts were real girls, sacrificed before they could even become women. More than 600 years later, Isabel's voice still echoes, not through royal decrees, but through the aching humanity of her letters, her silence at the altar, her longing for freedom. Her story is not just history, it's a warning, a child queen made to play in a world that had no place for children. Isabel's story demands that we look inward. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, how entire societies can learn to justify the unthinkable. How innocence can be bartered, how childhood can be sacrificed, all in the name of diplomacy, legacy, and political ambition. The little girl who was delivered as a diplomatic gift at 6 years old never had the chance to be a child. From the moment she crossed the threshold of St. Paul's Cathedral, adorned in gold too heavy for her tiny frame, her life ceased to belong to her. She became a vessel, a bridge between nations, a living treaty. What should have been the burden of rulers and kings became hers to carry. The decisions made in courtrooms and council halls pressed down on a child's shoulders, and no one asked if she was strong enough to bear it. Isabelle of France stands as a haunting symbol of childhood vulnerability in the face of unchecked power. Her life, a tapestry of manipulation, forced unions, and stolen joy, reminds us that behind every elegant treaty, every royal marriage, and every polished throne room in history, there were often children whose lives were quietly broken to serve the ambitions of the powerful. She was the girl queen who bought peace with her freedom. She was the bride child who bore the weight of kingdoms. And in the end, she paid the ultimate price, her own happiness, her future, her life, all surrendered for a war-weary peace that would not last. Let us not forget her, not as a queen, not as a figure in a history book, but as a little girl who wanted to go home and never truly could.